Good afternoon, YouTube. I've been meaning to do this video for a while, but I'd lost one of my knives. It's been lost for nearly a year, actually, this one. Lost it in the house. I've just found it, so I thought I would do a video on whittling. I've heard some of the other knife reviewers talk about learning to whittle before. I'm not brilliant by any stretch, but I've been using these for about a year now. I wanted to go over some of the fundamental differences in the knives that are sold as whittling knives. If you are whittling from home, I would highly suggest that you get a set like this. These are obviously made by a company called FlexCut, which I believe is an American company, and they are dedicated whittling knives. They're in a high quality carbon steel. Couldn't tell you exactly what the steel is, but they do hold an edge very well. You've got 3 different shapes, which is interesting when it comes to whittling knives. I would say the first one is more of a Warncliffe shape, I would call that. This is far more pointy, but I guess still a Warncliffe. This one I would say is more of a sheep's foot. You've got that knuckle at the front there, but they all have their uses. They're all very thin. The cat is about to come and intervene. I'm sorry, I have a kitten now, doesn't leave me alone. They're all relatively thin, and there is a certain blade shape that lends itself to whittling knives. Get out of it, cat. You have the flat grind about halfway up the blade. Don't know whether you would call that a saber grind. I think that's when it's hollow rather than flat. But this particular blade shape lends itself to woodwork in particular. It's very strong. These knives, as I say, hold an edge for a good long while because they're a good quality carbon steel, but obviously that means that they will rust. So you have to maintain them and keep them oiled. They're probably thinner than you're used to seeing with most knives, but that is for a very good reason. When it's not an everyday knife, it's a wood knife, a lot of the cuts that you're going to be doing are, like a stop cut initially, and then push cuts, and these just glide through the material really, really easily. Very little, it's really hard to do behind the camera, very little resistance, which makes them perfectly suited for the job. I mean, the FlexCut ones are relatively expensive for whittling knives, but there is a certain amount of truth in the phrase that you get what you pay for. I mean, these are brilliant. I use these when I'm whittling at home, not as much as I would like to these days, but when you are whittling at home, a nice set like that are really comfortable. They're long enough, proper size blades, nice and thin. They are perfect. At the same time as I got those, I got a FlexCut multi knife, if you like, and this is the this is what I would take camping if I was going out somewhere and I couldn't take that full set. I would say they're not the easiest things to open, but you have, I close the other one, you have a blade very similar to the fixed blades. They're obviously made by the same company, same carbon steel, very similar width, and you notice you have quite a lot of space between the bottom of the handle and the edge. That tends to be a common theme on whittling knives because it keeps your fingers away from the knife. Quite a large sharpening choil. But again, you've got that kind of Warncliffe sheep's footy type blade, relatively small, but that's going to do everything that you need. It's a nice mix between the different blade shapes and sizes that you've got there. You can do pretty much everything with something that size. It's almost like a razor. It's really, really thin, very, very sharp. And that's one thing I would say about whittling knives. You've got to keep them razor sharp. It's no good them being kind of sharp. You have to have nice clean cuts, which you can see on there where they're smooth. It's not digging out any divots or anything. In most of the cuts that you're doing with whittling knives, there'll be stop cuts, or there'll be push cuts, or there'll be paring cuts towards yourself. So having that as sharp as it can be possibly be, and very thin blade stock, is important. The reason being, if it's not sharp enough, you have to apply more pressure to the wood. You know, if you're really pushing against that and you slip, you're far more likely to cut yourself. The very basic Rough Rider whittler that I had a while ago, I've given it away now. I cut that myself with that a few times for that reason. It just didn't get sharp enough. It didn't hold an edge long enough because it was basic 440A. You could get it very sharp, but you've got to consider that you're working with wood, not paper, cardboard, the things that you would usually be doing with your EDC knives. So that would be one of my first recommendations. Go for a high quality carbon steel. Keep it oiled so it doesn't rust, but that will stand you in much better stead than going for something like 440A. The advantage of this, I mean, these are, I forget how much they were, but they're relatively expensive for whittling knives. This I think was about 60 quid. You have the main whittling blade, the bonus being as well that these lock. This is a lock knife. You cannot close that again without pushing. It's almost like a back lock, pushing the lock and closing it. But you don't just have a blade on one of these dedicated whittling knives. I mean, they're not particularly smooth. They're quite hard to open, but the tools are very good. You have, I think you call that a scorp. It's basically like a rounded chisel. And with that you can do your V cuts without actually having to dig in with the knife one side and dig in the knife with the other side. So that's very handy. That locks, all the tools lock on this thing. On the other side you have another very similar gouge. This one is curved. I'll show you what kind of effect you get with that. If you're doing details of hair or fire or something where the bottom of it needs to be rounded, I can't do it behind the camera, but you can see what I mean. You can see how that gouges out a rounded bit of the wood, which you would find it virtually impossible to do with just a blade. So having those on there is very handy. Close that one, and there is one more to show you. I'm sorry, this whole thing's out of focus. Okay, the last one is just a straight gouge. You can see they are very, very sharp. But if you're doing something where you've made a figure and you want to do the beard, you know, hair, fire, that kind of thing, these tools are really, really useful. Because as I say, you can't really do that just with a knife. Anyway, this in itself, as a pocket knife, they're not particularly smooth opening and closing. They're a bit rough. Probably could do with cleaning out. It's a bit dirty. They're not super high quality, but the material itself, the steel is very good. They're very sharp. They're the right thickness. FlexCut know what they're doing when it comes to making a whittling knife. So that was what I used to use if I was going somewhere camping or something like that, rather than taking the full set. You can take that, you can do everything you need with that. The downside of this obviously being that all the tools lock. So this is illegal in the UK as an everyday carry. Never really a problem for me. If I'm going and staying in a caravan or a tent or something, then you have you know, a good reason to be carrying it. But do be aware that they are locking tools on the FlexCut. And that brings me to cheaper options. When I lost this one, I still wanted something I was going to be able to take away with me in case I wanted to do the odd bit of whittling or what have you, stick whittling. So this was the second Rough Rider that I bought. It's covered in oil at the moment because I've just sprayed some inside. It's micarta on the outside. This is a Rough Rider Seahorse Whittler, and it's called the Seahorse Whittler because of that main blade. It almost looks like a seahorse. And this is a great design. The basic Rough Rider Whittler that I had beforehand, it was too small. It was a spear point blade, which didn't really lend itself. It was 440A, which didn't hold an edge long enough. You know, it might be fine for your everyday task, but when it comes to cutting wood, you know, you need that extra edge retention. I really like the design of this. You know, it's a full 4-finger grip. The blade itself is away from your fingers. You have this gap like you would do on the proper dedicated whittling knives. I guess my only complaint about this would be the blade is a little bit big, really, if you compare it to the others. However, this is a carbon steel, Rough Rider's carbon steel, so it holds an edge better, and it does get plenty sharp enough to be able to do your whittling tasks. It doesn't go through the material quite as smoothly as the flex cut ones, but then you've got to consider this is 20 quid as opposed to kind of 60 for the multi-tool light. I forget what they were, but this is much cheaper, and it does do the job. I mean, as I say, I would prefer to have this blade a little bit smaller, but on the Rough Rider you do also get 2 pen blades for, let's close the main blade, you get 2 pen blades, one either side. I'm not sure why. I think one would have been fine. So you can do more detailed work. If you've already carved out the majority of what you're whittling, you just want to, you know, fine tune and shave little bits, they are perfectly adequate for doing that. You can round over all those edges. So I think, you know, for 20 quid, this really fits the bill. I'm pleased that they went for the seahorse shape over and above, you know, just a normal spear point or pen blade. It's the right shape. It's a nice Warncliffe. Your fingers are far enough away, you're protected, and it's a good, decent enough carbon steel that holds an edge for long enough. So I bought this obviously when I lost this. If I had my choice out of the two, obviously I would take the flex cut because you have the extra tools available. But if you're just looking to give it a go and start out, maybe buy something cheap, have a go at whittling some sticks or something, then this is perfectly adequate. It's a split back whittler. You can see that gap in between the 2 back springs there. It's got a decent, you know, a decent amount of tension on the back spring, so I wouldn't be worried about it closing on me, and it is a really useful blade shape. One thing I would say, you know, if you're gonna have a go at whittling for the first time, I would recommend 2 things that you will need. A little leather strop, even if you're going to take it away with you, because it's not good enough for a whittling knife to be sort of sharp, you know, cutting paper sharp. It has to be razor sharp. So keeping on top of that constantly after every use, just give it a bit on the strop, and that will make a good companion. The second thing I would recommend, when I can find them, is a pair of these, and these are cut resistant gloves. And the best thing I find, I don't like to hold one in the I don't like to wear one on my knife holding hand, but if you are working away on a piece of wood like that, it makes sense that you would have a pair of those, just in case you creep your finger up, and as you're pushing, you don't want to be digging into the end of your finger. These do work. You know, it doesn't cut you through those gloves. So I'd recommend getting a pair of those. They're cheap. It's worthwhile if you want to give it a go. So that is my whittling knife collection. Hope it's of use to somebody. Really like the little £20 Seahorse Whittler, but I would also recommend flex cut if you think it's something you're going to stick at for a while. It's better investing in the best tools, isn't it? Hope that's of use to people. Take care. Ta-ta.